Is the first annual Professor Charles B. Garabedian Lecture, which was established at NAASR by our board member and niece of the late Professor Garabedian, Joan Cilician. And I would like to ask Joan, if she wouldn't mind, to stand and be thanked. Thank you, Joan. That was barely standing, but okay. We're very pleased to be holding it at Tufts, and we certainly hope that having it here at Tufts will be an annual tradition. So thank you also to the Tufts Armenian Club, and to Michael, and to the Darakchi and Jafarian Chair in Armenian Studies, Ina McCabe, from whom we will hear shortly, for collaborating with us. Professor Garabedian was born in 1917, died in 1991, was the son of Balthasar and Elmas Garabedian, and was born in Everett, Massachusetts. He was a magna cum laude graduate of Everett High School, magna cum laude graduate of Tufts University, hence our presence here, where he received his bachelor's in English and in history. He attended Harvard Law School and graduated magna cum laude from Boston University Law School. During the Second World War, he served in the Office of Strategic Services, the OSS, and in the late 1940s, he began his teaching career at Suffolk University Law School in Boston. His expertise was tort litigation and damages, courses which he continuously taught at Suffolk for more than 40 years. At the time of his death, Professor Garabedian was the senior faculty professor at Suffolk University Law School. And in addition to his legal career and his professorial career, Professor Garabedian was highly dedicated to the advancement of Armenian organizations and the Armenian Apostolic Church, and involved in Armenian affairs. So we are honored and very pleased and blessed to hold this event tonight in his memory. And before I hand the microphone to Professor McCabe, I also want to acknowledge and thank another attendee here tonight, Professor Lucy Dermanuelian, who brought Armenian studies to Tufts University so many years ago and made it a force here. So Lucy, thank you. So without further ado, let me give the microphone to Professor Ina McCabe. Ina.
It is my pleasure, indeed I'm delighted, to introduce a beloved colleague here at Tufts, Christina Maranci. Christina Maranci is the Arthur H. Dadian and Ara Osmel Chair of Armenian Art and Architectural History at Tufts University, and she's also chair of the department, and I know what that means. She has held visiting positions in Armenian art at the University of Chicago and at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. She's the author of 3 books and over 60 articles and essays on medieval Armenian art and architecture, including most recently The Art of Armenia, an introduction with Oxford University Press. I must add, it's the first overview of Armenian art ever. And so, her most recently published monograph on the 7th century architecture of Armenia won the Sona Aronian Prize for Best Armenian Studies monograph from the National Association for Armenian Studies and Research, and the Karen Gould Prize for Art History from the Medieval Academy of America. That should be the Karen Gould class. Sorry, professional defamation. I see Karen, I read Karen. Maranci has she wrote Maranci. I would say Christina Maranci has engaged with the cultural heritage of Armenians for over a decade, working on historical Armenian churches and monasteries in what is now Eastern Turkey. That is not an easy job. Her campaign for the Cathedral of Mren near Ani in present-day Eastern Turkey resulted in its inclusion on the World Monument Watch List for 2015-17. And that's quite an accomplishment. Without further ado, I leave the podium to tonight's speaker.
Thank you so much. I might squint a little bit because I can't find my glasses and I'm getting to that age, but I can still see, and it's okay because I don't need notes for this. Are those reading glasses? Oh yes, those. That's great. No, Robert found my glasses. So helpful. I'll thank you later. Okay. Oh, fabulous. Okay. Okay. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, NAASR. Thank you, Ina. Where did Ina go?
Here.
Okay, all right. And thanks to the Tufts Armenian Club. Thanks to all of you for coming out tonight. It's late. My bedtime is like 8 p.m., so this is like for me too. You know Tufts has 2 Armenian chairs. Ina holds one, I hold the other. That's very unusual for university. But the fact that both of us are women is just astonishingly unusual. So we just need to note that that's a great thing. So the authoritative and archeological professor is the only endowed chair of Armenian art outside of the Republic. And again, as Mark did, I want to acknowledge Lucy Dermanwellian for founding the chair, tirelessly advocating for Armenian art, and I feel I owe so much to you, Lucy. Thank you so much for making this happen. Can the lights go down any, or is that, it doesn't really matter, I mean, it'll be fine. Okay. Anyway, I'm going to tell you tonight about my new book. I wrote it over a period of, how many years? About 3 years, from about late 2014 to this past summer. It's not a massive survey. I brought 2 of those. 2 big surveys of Armenian art, and you can see, Lucy, these belong to you actually, but I inherited them. This is one, and this is another one. These are 2 excellent surveys of Armenian art. My book is not like that. It's an introduction to the field, and let me explain to you what it is, first of all. So it's an introduction to the field from prehistory to the early 18th century, all media. So architecture, manuscripts, and so on. So why did I write this book? Well, first of all, I've been teaching Armenian art here. I can't believe I'm going to say this, but I've been teaching it here for 10 years. I've been teaching Armenian art in general for 20 years, which is a long time. And I really felt that it was time for me to write my own sort of story of Armenian art. It was the right time, it just felt right. But the other reason is I needed something to give my students to read. These books are great. They're in English, which is a good thing. But they have limitations. For one, the most important limitation is they're both from the 80s. And so much has happened in Armenian art, new discoveries, new ways of thinking about the subject. Art history has changed a great amount since the 1980s. So it was high time, no pun intended, it was high time for a new study that took account of all the changes in the field. For example, Bronze Age archaeology has changed the way we think about ancient Armenia. There have been new studies of Armenian manuscripts that incorporate codicology and liturgy, very exciting new interdisciplinary work efforts in manuscript work. Wonderful new catalogs, like the new catalog of the Met exhibit, although obviously I didn't incorporate that because that just came out. But wonderful new catalogs of exhibits, particularly from around 2015, when a lot of museums, large and small, had exhibitions on Armenia. New waves of scholarship in cultural heritage and social memory, all of that was out there, and I really wanted to be able to bring that to students in a cohesive way. So that was my plan. Just to give you a sense of sort of what this means on the ground. This is a magnificent early Christian basilica in Armenia, in the Republic. It's called Ereluk. And, you know, this is the sentence that explains it from this book, which to an undergraduate, I think you can imagine it, to an American undergraduate, that quote, the general aspect of Ereluk, evokes the large Syrian basilicas of the 6th century Torman, it wouldn't mean very much. And so, although I did assign these worthy books, I really found myself frustrated with what they assumed on the part of the student. And I wanted to be able to do better than that for the American university student. So that's what I tried to do with this book. The other thing I wanted to do with this book is speak to the art historian, the non-specialist, and in a way that was sort of appropriate and on the right academic level. So, for example, a Byzantinist of Princeton, or somebody who does Latin America, or just have something that was useful, that was within the discipline of art history that could explain what our field is about. So also I wanted to speak to this other reading public, the non-specialist scholar. I also meant this book, I intended this book, or I hope it serves, the Armenian community, because, as a member of it myself, I grew up with Cilician Association's Armenian manuscript sitting on the coffee table, but I didn't really know what it was all about. And so a lot of us, in the community know about the monasteries and we know about Garni, but when was Garni built? For whom? Well, actually, we don't actually know because it's very complicated, but that's again where you want to introduce the scholarship, you want to introduce the problems in a scholarly, rigorous way. So that we're not just appreciating these beautiful, important monuments, but we understand something about them. And so that, again, was a goal. Speaking to the Armenian community for whom these monuments mean so much. Okay, so let's move on. So I started with the ancient period, and you'll find in these books, there's about a couple pages in each about antiquity, really late antiquity. But I wanted to start, or maybe I'm crazy, but I wanted to start at the very beginning. I wanted to start with the very beginning, the earliest material culture that we've had. In part because, again, there have been so many exciting archaeological discoveries in the past 40 years. So I wanted to capture that. And so I started all the way with Paleo-lithic and worked my way up into the late antique period. It was not easy. And that's where I really felt my limitations as an art historian, because ancient art, even using terms like that, are problematic, but draw from the fields of archeology and anthropology, and then really, this scholarship is extremely specialist. So that took the longest time. I waded my way through it to produce a cohesive chapter on the ancient period. But it was very, very hard. And in fact, one of the reviews of the book said, she shouldn't be doing this, she's a medievalist. Of course that just, like for some other people I know, that just gets me all wound up and then I have to do it. So that's what I did. The same reviewer said, you shouldn't be talking about 18th century stuff, you don't know about that either. Again, okay, that's just now a dare for me. So anyway, so this is important because this really is a service. There's nothing out there that gives you, there are brilliant articles on, let's say, Hellenistic Armenia, what that even means. But giving the students something that tells the story in a kind of authoritative way, using the scholarship of pre-Christian Armenia, was not out there. So this was really hard to do, but I'm very proud with how it came out. And I did have my colleagues who are actually specialists in pre-Christian archaeology check it out, so I don't think there are too many terrible mistakes. You're looking at an example of an Urartian fortress, Van Fortress. Some of you may know it. This is a plan of Erebuni Fortress. Some people are laughing, my students, because they know these things already. And I'm very glad to see my students in the audience. So for example, just to give you an example of some of the exciting scholarship, there was an interesting study recently that did a spatial analysis of Urartian fortresses, looking at the way that you are kind of led through spaces, and how control is established by essentially making it so that you can only go one way through this space. You see what I'm looking at this? Hopefully you can see that. You're not given too many choices. So you can, this was presented in a scholarly paper, and I thought, this is exciting. This is a new way of looking at the Urartian fortress. Let's bring this to the students. So that's just one thing that I did. Another really exciting thing I think about ancient Armenia is that it is neither easily absorbed within the parameters of the ancient Near East or the classical Mediterranean, as my students know, because I always tell them this. In fact, if you look at art history surveys and you look at the chapter on classical art, you're never going to see this lovely statuette that you see on the right, which shows every sign of Hellenistic, all the features of Hellenistic sculpture, contrapposto, the wet drapery. In fact, if you look for things in English on this beautiful sculpture, you're going to find almost nothing. I found almost nothing. It's sometimes surprising as a scholar when you think, oh, this is so famous, and then you look for things, actual things written on it that are scholarly, and it's amazing how little there is. This is what happened with that statuette. On the other hand, going back in time, this bronze figurine from the Urartu, the period of Urartian period, is very much tied to Assyrian traditions, but you're not going to see this in survey books on the ancient Near East. Not likely. What happens is those other fields tend to focus on either Mesopotamia or, but not Urartu. The classical textbooks tend to focus more closely on the Mediterranean. So Armenian art, these very interesting examples, tend to be ignored. And what's in fact the most interesting thing about ancient Armenia, is that it's neither one thing or another. And it challenges those tidy borders of classical ancient Near East. I mean, those are things we've made up, obviously, as art historians. But this material culture is not so easily summarized. And I wanted to convey that complexity to the students. And this you'll see in, again, as we move forward. But I don't want to... Okay, Garni, you know Garni. Garni was a wonderful case where, of course, I know this, a lot of us know this monument, we may have even been there. And it's a complicated monument because it was reconstructed in the Soviet period. It collapsed in an earthquake in 1639. But what I did during the book, which I actually really, I'm so grateful for the opportunity to do it, is I really looked at it carefully. I mean, if you start looking at the reliefs, the entablature, the Ionic columns, it's a fascinating building. The history is really complicated. There are lots of different arguments about it. That's another thing that makes ancient Armenia problematic. It's very polemical. There are lots of debates about it. And so trying to come to terms with that was not easy. But, again, it's worth it because this material is so rich and it deserves to be, students deserve to see it. Okay, let's move forward. So then I go to chapter 2, and actually chapters 2, 3, 4, and 5 deal with the Middle Ages, and that's where I'm more comfortable. It's my territory. Chapter 2 is mostly like Christianity, early 4th century to the 7th century. And so we deal with some of the famous monuments of that moment, like Prupsime, which is a beautiful domed tetrachon. So part of what I do is explaining, analyzing architecture in my classes and in the book. And I should say, this book was so much, as my students know, informed by my teaching. There's no way I could have written it had I not been teaching this class here at Tufts for the last 10 years. So I absolutely owe it to my students. I see them in the front row right there. Hi, Jillian, how are you? Okay. Okay, and then the plan of Prupsime, this beautiful church on the right. So I won't get into too many details, but I wanted you to just have a sense of the kinds of the monuments that we're talking about here. Zvartnots, the church of Zvartnots, again, I won't go into details. This was the subject of my book before, the earlier book, but there I just wanted to show you. Next shot by Hrad-Khachkars. This chapter, chapter 2, considers also some of the earliest manuscript painting we have, the Etchmiadzin and Gospels on the left, and an example of a stele sculpture on the right, which is an unusual tradition to have this kind of outdoor stele sculpture, which we see in Armenia. And so, looking at the imagery, looking at the sculpture, gave me the chance also to do something else in this book which is not done in the previous books, and that is bring in texts. I feel it's very important for the students, even if they don't read Armenian, to have a sense of what people were saying, what they were talking about, what they were listening to, in addition to looking at these works. So with buildings, we talk about inscriptions. With manuscripts, we talk about the text. In this case, we don't have, actually, this is just an image. We don't have, this belongs to a set of images that have no accompanying text. The stele on the right can, however, like the manuscript, be understood in terms of a written source from this period that talks about image worship. So I felt it was important for our students to understand not just the sort of iconography of these objects and, let's say, their place in the landscape in the case of the stele, but also the kinds of problems that images caused in the 7th century in Armenia. Should they be worshipped? Should they not be worshipped? What's the best way to do that? What sorts of images should be worshipped? And so we have a rich textual tradition as well as a material and visual tradition that we can bring to bear, that we should bring to bear on these on this material. So that's also what I tried to do. It's not just about looking at the images, it's about understanding their context, and that brings us to text. So that was also very important for me to do in this book. Okay, that's pretty. So that's Ani. That brings us to the 3rd chapter, which is the Age of the Kingdoms. And the Age of the Kingdoms is a term I made up, but it does kind of exist. And it's about the period after the Islamic conquest of historical the Armenian territory. And it starts in the 9th century and goes to the 11th century when the Seljuks take the area with the Battle of Manzikert. So it's, does that make 3 centuries? So 3, okay. And during this period we have kingdoms in Armenia. And the most, I think the kind of crucial one is the Bagratid kingdom in the north. Anyway, I think it is. And the Bagratid kingdom included the city of Ani, and you see a view of this is just a kind of a tiny corner of Ani, actually. This is the kind of back door of Ani here. And Ani, I should say, is in what is now eastern Turkey. It's over the border, over the closed international border with the Republic of Armenia. So sometimes we call it Western Armenia. So Ani is a beautiful site, and it was, I had 80,000 words to work with. I was not allowed to go over that. And with my dear husband, we did a lot of judicious cutting of, like, can we cut this tiny word? Every sentence had to be sort of, put on a diet. But this is the Cathedral of Ani, which you can see is just a masterpiece of architecture in terms of its refinement. I always tell my students, this is rubble masonry technique. This is actually masonry slabs that are facing a rubble core. So it looks like solid stone, but it's not. It is extremely carefully joined revetment. So this church I discuss in some detail. This is the interior view and a plan, and you can see the interior view, that sort of refinement, that sophistication, and really what's nice is that the architecture of this period draws from the 7th century, so it created some continuity in my book, and then you have the plan on the right. But I also wanted to go beyond Ani, because Ani is, it's well known to historians of Armenian art, but and would be the most likely subject for students to hear about. But I also wanted them to just leave out the gates of Ani for a bit and go to nearby sites like this one, which is an incredibly beautiful 11th century church, a rotunda, again on the eastern Turkey side, western Armenia side, beautifully situated. Again, using that red revetment, rubble masonry type thing. I wanted you to see this because because it's in such bad condition. And one thing I tried to get across to in my book is that these monuments are living monuments. You know, we can study them as historical subjects, but they're not in pristine condition. In fact, this is an emergency condition, and this could come down at any moment. Ani Cathedral, as famous and celebrated as it is also in very bad shape. So, so part of my sort of remit, as I saw it, in writing this was to call attention to the ephemerality of these monuments. They're not just going to be standing up because we want them to. So that's Conch, great name. And then after dealing with the Babur Kingdom, I moved down south to talk about the kingdom of Skuragan, which is in the southern part of Armenia, now in eastern Turkey, in the south part. So this is the Church of Akhtamar. Again, actually, this is among the most famous of Armenian churches in an Anglophone scholarly context. So this church is the only church that actually made this survey, the art history survey that is commonly used, Maryland Stockstadt's art history. This showed up for one edition, then it disappeared. So yeah, it apparently didn't make the cut the next time around. So, but Akhtamar was the one church, which is really kind of odd because it's in many ways it's unusual. It raises the question about like, what do you include in a survey? What don't you? Well, should you include things that are representative? That's a whole issue that we can discuss at some other point. But I had to talk about Akhtamar, of course, and its amazing sculpture. And I was glad to go there with a couple of people that are here in 2016 to take some photos for myself. So it was always good to be able to use your own photos because it's a lot cheaper than buying photos from libraries and other things. I told you I included other kinds of media, so other than sculpture and architecture and manuscripts, I also wanted to include other things. So these are two objects, and I believe both of them are on view in New York at the Met Show, or similar. The sensor, if not that incense burner, then the similar one. So both of these are works from the Age of the Kingdoms and give a sense of various kind of strains of that art. On the upper, the wooden capital evokes some Abbasid forms, so Islamic Abbasid forms. And of course, the Abbasid world was just to the south of Armenia. And the censer, which was excavated Ani, is also very, very interesting. And here, this is where I tried, I'm just kind of giving you a sense of my methodology, I tried to think about how this would have been used, remembering that we're looking at it now in a PowerPoint or a keynote, actually, and we might go to a museum and see it in a vitrine, but it would have been swung, and it would have been smelling of incense, and it would have maybe made noise because there are bells on it. So I tried to give the student a sense, not just of the art historical phenomenon of the censer, but also the whole kind of spectacle of it in all its sensory glory. So that was kind of another thing that I tried to do throughout. And I tried to do that also with, for example, chariot ornaments from Urartu, which we can also think about in the same way. So anyway, manuscript painting from the same period. It's interesting because we actually see different kinds of styles emerge. So we have a kind of elegant style that makes connections with Byzantine art of the same period. We have the Echmiadzin and Gospels on the left, and then beautiful Gospel of Kars, Gagikabas, on the right. This one in Yerevan now, living in Yerevan now, and the other one in Jerusalem. And I have to say that the manuscript libraries from which I got these images were extremely generous and kind, and I was very lucky to be able to work with them because these are very special manuscripts. But in addition to this style, we also have this, which I love, but people have their own opinion about it. So this manuscript is from 966. It is in the Walters Art Gallery in Baltimore, which has, by the way, a wonderful collection of Armenian manuscripts. So should you be in that area, you should see them because they're fabulous. And this is the oldest that I know of, oldest Armenian manuscript in the United States. And it's called the Gospels of the Priest. And it shows the Virgin and Child on some kind of a carpet or something like that. and then with a kind of elaborate arcade around it. And I just think it's such an interesting comparison to make between these two. So you have, on the one hand, this very elegant, I don't think of your own adjectives that you want to use, on the left, and then you have on the right this very different image that's doing something very different. And I've taught this to my classes for a long time, and students have had various reactions to the image on the left. But again, this is where texts are helpful. So the text in that box is the text that says, be joyful. Be joyful. Urach lev, herrial der utkets. So the Lord is with you. Be joyful. The Lord is with you. And then in the colophon, which is the in the back, it's the kind of scribal note saying, I made this at this time. We learn that we should enjoy, this was made for the enjoyment of the congregation. And I don't know, but I look at this and it does look very joyful. Look at those nice colors and the way Virgin is kind of, the open visages, I think that's the words I used. It's a very different message that's being communicated to you than that of the Virgin and Child on the left. Not lesser, I don't think, but it's important for us to understand these were produced around the same time, within 20 years of each other, doing very different things, but okay. And then at the end of I end the Age of the Kingdoms chapter by talking about this manuscript, and this is just one page from it. It's called the Sankha Gospels. We think it was made near Ani. It is from 1053, so just around the time when the Byzantines conquered the Bagratid kingdom, and just about 20 years before the Seljuks come. And it's so interesting to look at this and look at what kinds of motifs are emerging. You can see, if you study Islamic art or Byzantine art, where's Marina? Anyway, there you are. Maybe you can see some pseudo-script in Arabic, pseudo-script in the vessel, maybe also in the arcade. Notice that the bare-breasted sphinx with the beard this is a detail on the right. Do you see that? He's kind of confronting a beast over here. So, some fascinating imagery that seems to draw from classical, from Abbasid, maybe classical via Abbasid traditions. And all this is happening at the very end of the life of the kingdom. So what's interesting to me is that the artistic landscape seems to be broadening, not contracting at this moment. That there is in fact more, the repertoire is growing. So that idea of that sort of broadening of the artistic landscape we can see also when we go to Cilician, or Cilician, which is the subject of chapter 4. And so this is the only chapter that kind of breaks the chronology a little bit, because Cilician needs its own space. Basically, this is a kingdom that's in southwestern Asia Minor, just north of Cyprus. And it was a kingdom an Armenian kingdom between 1199 and 1375. So it was right on the Mediterranean. And it was a place of an Armenian two royal dynasties. We have from Cilicia fortresses, and we have manuscripts. We have other things too. We have reliquaries and other things. But I focused on the fortresses and the manuscripts. And this fortress is Anavarza Fortress, which is one of the many spectacular Cilician fortresses. They were studied really well by Robert Edwards in the 1980s. And I used his literature very extensively in my book. It's always fun to read things, though, that are from a few decades back, because you're thinking, that's so interesting, but that's all he says. Why didn't he say more? And that's how I felt about this church, which was built in the fortress of Anavarza. It's the Church of Toros. Toros was a Rubenid or Cilician prince, built in 1111. So how can you beat that? It's easy to remember if you get it on a test, which happens. But anyway, so what you're looking at is the east facade of the church on the upper left, and you're looking at the west facade on the right. This is a detail. And what's so fascinating is that in the cornice line, you can see there's a relief inscription. That's in Armenian. It's actually giving the genealogy of Toros. So it's wonderful to be able to say, okay, this is the Rubenid dynasty, and they're announcing this. Which is so interesting, of course, because they weren't here forever, right? They came to this area. The Byzantines were pushed out. They took over. But here you're getting this sense of a long lineage. You see that amazing portal? That portal is actually made up of spolia. It's recycled materials from the Byzantine town below. And Edwards, I was so fascinated by this. Apparently, you can't see it in this slide. There's a Greek inscription that actually is shown in these voussoirs. They're called voussoirs, these arch stones. The inscription in Greek was originally something like, and this is going to butcher the Greek, but eulogios o theos, or something like that, praise to God. And then you can see that it's a weird arch. It's not really an arch. It's sort of weirdly, V-shaped. In this version, it just says eulogios, just praise. What happened is the Armenian masons removed some of the stones because they didn't need a big arch the size there was below. And so they took parts of it. It's still legible, it's still decipherable as a Greek word. And they've put it up here. So you have this fascinating relationship with the Greek down below. You have these Rubenid princes. Toros is one of them. This is before even the kingdom starts, who is announcing his power and in a way kind of staking a claim on the landscape with this facade. I should say, I'm showing you old photographs because it doesn't look like this anymore. So this is one of those churches, an Armenian church, that's really suffered in the decades of the 20th century particularly. So these are precious photographs taken by Gertrude Bell, who was a pioneering archaeologist in the early 20th century. She went there, and if you haven't read her work or her accounts of visiting Cilicia, but particularly Anavarza, they're amazing. She was apparently very brave, because when she went to Anavarza, she was standing in the church, and all these vipers, there was a den of vipers above her, and they fell down in thuds, like all around her. So that was kind of scary, but she got these amazing photos, and I'm thankful to her for that. Okay. So moving on to the spectacular manuscripts from Armenian Cilicia, and I'm moving straight to our celebrity artist of the night, Toros Roslin. Toros Roslin lived in the latter half of the 13th century, and he was a court painter. He painted for the royal Cilician families, and this is one of his one example of many. He was very prolific. This is in the Freer Gallery in DC. So, in case you're interested. This is a fascinating image that really speaks to his particular, his métier, I think you would say. He knew Byzantine art, he knew Western European art, and he was obviously a very skilled artist visually. But he also was a theologian, and we can sort of think about that by looking at the texts and the iconography together. The text is from Luke, so maybe you can see. Where's Julia? Okay, so a little classical Armenian for you. It says over on the right-hand column, it says, he shows them his hands and feet, right, over there. So he's showing the wounds in his hands and feet to the apostles. But there are some strange things about this, anomalous things. The mountains, the door in the corner, which actually relate to other gospel texts. The incredulity of Thomas, which is, I think, John. Or is it Luke? I have it in my notes, but I don't feel like walking over. And then the mountain is from another gospel text. And then the prophet Zechariah peeks out from behind in the mountains, telling yet another text, giving another text, talking about his wounds. So this is a great example of the way Toros Roslin is bringing together different biblical texts to kind of, in a way, produce a visual exegesis. I also drew attention in the book to the way he worked with pages and worked with compositions. This is my favorite. This is The Last Judgment from a Walters Art Gallery, Toros Roslin manuscript. The Last Judgment which shows Christ at the, can you see it? This is the detail. Christ at the top, judging. But what I love is what appears on the left-hand side, which is in a detail. These are the foolish virgins. So the foolish virgins who did not have the oil to trim their lamps are not allowed into the kingdom of heaven. And Rosalind has shown this by actually having the apostles like bouncers, like, no, you're not coming in, sorry. And they're outside of the whole composition. They're not even allowed into the composition. So he's really fascinating in the way he plays with images and plays with margins, and so that was a pleasure. I should say, particularly for Cilician paintings, Sira Peter Nersessian, who is a great art historian of Armenian manuscripts, she was not helpful to me because she's not around anymore, but her work was so helpful to me. So I made great use of her, but as well as newer scholarship on Cilician art. I love this is not Charles Russell, but I love Cilician art of the 1280s, and my book cover is from this period. This is the craziest period, I think, in Armenian manuscript painting. I love it. This is a manuscript that was made, again, in the 1280s. It's Madanataran 979, that's just the shelf mark. And it shows the three Marys at the tomb, the empty tomb, the angel showing them it's empty. Peter's there looking over the tomb and seeing it's empty, and then you have the guards down below. But that does nothing to really explain to you or this image. It's just bursting. There are diagonals everywhere. I took a lot of time, and I thought it was important to do this for the reader, take a lot of time describing this. Because when you start looking at that angel, and the way it seems to be turning in so many different directions at once, one part is flexed this way, another part is flexed that way. Yet his face is sort of like ennui, I thought. Anyway, this is to me just spectacular. And equally spectacular, I think, is this, and this is on the cover. This is from the same manuscript, and it is a headpiece. This is a headpiece for the lectionary. This is the lectionary, so it's a selection of readings from the Bible for the personal use of one of the kings, Hetun II. So Christ in the center, in a medallion, surrounded by these amazing creatures. And this work has been noticed. I'm certainly not the first one to notice this. This has been carefully studied by scholars, and there's been a lot of very good work pointing to those creatures as testifying to the lively trade that was happening with East Asia at this point, China in particular, when, this is during the Mongol period. During the Mongol period, the Mongols were in control of China, and the Mongols also had an alliance with the Hetmanid kings. So we can very nicely make a connection with China, and therefore have a kind of sense of the possible diplomatic ties that would have engendered the mobility of objects, whether it's ceramics or silks that brought these ideas to the manuscript painter in Cilicia, which I thought is wonderful and really gives you a sense of the connected, mobile world of Cilicia. Having said all that, I of course had to add my own 2 cents, because what I wanted to do again was think about the texts. And so the texts are interesting because the reading is for the Annunciation to the Virgin. So it's a set of readings for the Feast of the Annunciation to the Virgin. And it includes a passage from Zechariah. And in that passage from Zechariah, which you don't see here, there's a passage that says, "All the nations of the earth will take refuge in me." So I thought that was a very nice theological dimension for this image. You can think about those creatures and the way they're sort of nestled in the headpiece around Christ. So I think we can think about this both in terms of economic history, political history, the trade routes informing this image and its cosmopolitanism, but we can also think about it in a theological sense, the way those creatures are surrounding Christ. Just another canon table, which is kind of index form from a different manuscript, also from this period. Nudes. Can you find the nudes? They're here. There's Adam and Eve, presumably, the nude male on the right, a female on the left. Can you see them? So just the flamboyance, the exuberance of this manuscript moment, 1280s, it's astounding. Will you find this in any art history surveys? No. So that, to me, that's why I put the Lectionary Petuum on the cover of my book, because I mean, maybe people will start noticing. Okay, so I'm almost done. Yeah. So returning to what we call Greater Armenia, so returning to the Armenian Highlands, the fifth chapter is about sort of the 13th to 15th centuries in Greater Armenia, and I look at monasteries, monastic complexes. This is Norabank. For Armenians, when you go to Armenia, you often go to Norabank. And so, of course, I had to include it. So I did talk a lot about monastic complexes, about monasticism. This is the Monastery of khachkars. These are staggeringly beautiful sites, again using that very refined masonry technique we see in the 7th century, and almost like little cities. Art historians have made a lot of, have noticed the sophistication of the vaulting systems that are used at this time. This is Khachkars, the Monastery of Khachkars I just showed you, and this is what's called, it's like an antechamber. For you students, this is like a preview of what's to come, because we haven't got here yet. But what you want to notice is an incredible vaulting system that's being used here, and this is kind of intersecting, big intersecting roof arches. Just another example of some vaulting from this period is, yeah, it's pretty cool. This is early 13th century from Ani. Ani was continued to be built on in the 13th century. So here you have an amazing vault. This is, again, in terrible condition, this monument. I'm not showing you the whole thing, but it's in terrible condition. But you can see some mukarnas vaulting here, as well as some amazing polychrome masonry. That's all polychrome, that's not painted. I mean, meaning these are red and black stones that have been fitted together, it's not paint. So, another example of, I love, this is Ganzasar, which I've never been to, gotta get there, but this is the portal of Ganzasar, which uses both kind of perforating sculpture, where it's drilled, the sculpture is drilled into the wall, but also you see relief sculpture, and then this amazing interlocking circle thing made of maroon and gray stones. Yeah, before I move on though, I just want to say that scholarship, again, has focused on these as architect, well, it hasn't focused, but architectural historians have noticed recently and acknowledged recently the ways in which Armenian architecture and Islamic architecture of the same period are looking at each other, and almost, you could say, appropriating ideas, maybe competing with each other, but you have an amazing virtuosity in terms of building in the 13th century in Armenia. And there's no question that these architects were looking at each other's ideas. At the same time that we have this sense of kind of ideas moving around, it's important also to acknowledge that these monuments give a strong sense of place, each one of them. And when you go, you really get the sense you are somewhere particular. So Norabank is a site where it almost feels like it's nestled into this cliff area. And I try also to talk about the landscape and the relationship between the buildings and the landscape, the way coloristically the buildings harmonize with the landscape around them. So important to understand both the idea that architectural forms are traveling, people are looking around them, but also that there's this strong sense of particular sites. Okay, I'm moving along. And then khachkars. Well, I have to spend time on khachkars. But khachkars are the Armenian sculptural form and a form of worship, you could say par excellence. The Met has a khachkar in there on permanent loan. And of course, I think we have 2 khachkars now from the Republic. Khachkars are sculpted steles with crosses, and they sometimes rise very high in the air. And this is one from the 13th century. By the 13th and 14th century, they become extremely intricate. They're sometimes called lace khachkars because they look like lace, but they're stone. I have to say that describing a khachkar is very hard. We all love them, or a lot of us love them, because they're beautiful and they're intricate, but when you try to describe one, again, as an art historical exercise, it's really hard. You really appreciate the workmanship that goes into them. And I try also to think a little bit more about theology here and think about how contemplating something that complex, that cannot be apprehended in a single moment, but takes time. In a way it's clear, but in a way it's infinitely complex and ineffable. The way one could think about that as a kind of appropriate image for meditating on God. So again, it was important for me to think about these works, not just in a kind of art historical frame, but also in a theological frame. Okay, so I looked also at ceramics. I learned a lot about ceramics and wood. And in fact, that lectern, the wooden lectern, is on view in the Armenia exhibit, so you can see that. I know I'm running out of time, but I have to. We're going to end this. We're going to end not the whole thing, but just this part with this beautiful manuscript that I love. There were so many manuscripts I could have chosen from this late period of Armenia, but I loved Cerun. Cerun was an artist in the Van region where Akhtamar was, and he painted a lot. He was part of this kind of whole group of painters who were painting in the same style, but Cerun's images are particularly jolly and cheerful, and this shows, of course, Christ walking on water. But what I love is that, again, the biblical verse to which this correlates is, you of little faith, why did you doubt? But then you look at how happy Christ is. Look at that cheerful face that he has as he's lifting Peter up from the waves. And so there's something really lovely about this. Cerun is really kind of a wonderful marker of this Van style of manuscripts, which goes on and on into the 16th century. Okay, moving on to the early modern period. This is just quick. We really had to, with the early modern period, a lot changes. I kind of budget. 15th century is, for me, kind of the marker between medieval and early modern, but I'm not exactly happy with that. But 15th century is, I start in the 15th and I go to the 18th century for the modern part, or early modern-ish. But it's really in the 17th century that you start seeing print culture invade all aspects of Armenian art. You really can't get away from it. This is the Boskan Bible. This is actually a copy at the Armenian Museum in Watertown. So, but print, which is already being made, Armenian print is already happening in the 16th century. By the 17th century, it's traveling a lot more, and we can see how it affects iconography. We can see also how it affects painting styles. And this is from the Philadelphia Museum, an Annunciation scene, which features a lot of those European iconographic motifs, but I think also in terms of style, and that single line for the mouth, or actually two little lines, and the brows. This, I think, is also drawn as much from an aesthetic of print. So it's more complicated than that, but that's just the beginning. Okay. This is a little pop quiz as we finish up. Which of these is by Toros Roslin, and which is the 17th century imitation of Toros Roslin? Let's see. Okay. So Toros Roslin is, Marina, you're saying it's the one on the left. You get an A. All right. Yes, Toros Roslin's on the left. So at the same time that we see print really, as I said, invade Armenian art, starting in the 17th century, we also see in the case of Mikhail, who was the painter of the image on the right, a really strong sense of tradition. Returning to those models, those Cilician models, and Mikhail does that. In fact, Mikhail also composes poems about canon tables. He composes poems and he composes commentaries, and he's a fascinating subject which has not really been studied at all. Someone needs to work on him. We've all heard about Toros Roslin, but who's heard about Mikhail of Sapastia? We need to do that work. All right. Yeah, so you were right, Marina. There you go. All right. And then just to wake you up, this is a 16th century, just backing up a little bit, a 16th century painter named Hako who had his own style. And look, it's not just about talking about traditions. It's sometimes about, that one artist who's doing something different. Hako wandered around the Ottoman world. He wandered around, he didn't really have a home. He got deported to New Julfa. He went with these deportations, we'll talk about that in a minute, to New Julfa, where he painted houses, but during his time wandering around, he painted these amazing scenes of the creation in his Gospels. And God appears as this massive face. As you turn the pages, he gets larger and larger, his face. And this is what he did. So it's fascinating to think about what was in his head when he was painting that, but we're going to move on. All right, so, I wanted to, as I said, I wanted to include textiles. We don't have a whole lot of early textiles. This is one of the very earliest ones. You can see this at the Met. You can see this at the Met. An example, our first example, not our first total, but maybe our first example of a mother-daughter team of artists. Yes, Aziz Khatun and her mother Gohar Melik embroidered this textile. So there you have it. In my book, I think about what it meant to be women needle workers. I'm painting this scene of King Turdat, the pagan king of Armenia, who converted Armenia to Christianity, Gregory, the patron saint, and Hripsime. For those of you who don't know the stories, it's okay, but Hripsime is resisted Turdat's advances, and for that she was martyred. There's a lot of interesting, there's a whole context here that can be teased out in terms of gender, and we can't ignore the fact that this was a pair of mother-daughter needleworkers. So I'm just putting that out there. I talk about it in the book because that's important to know. And I think, yeah, nobody's really talked about that, so it's time to talk about it. So just a mitre, I got here into the later 17th century when historical Armenia is divided between the Ottoman and Safavid worlds. I know I need to stop soon. But what I thought was so interesting about this mitre is that, again, it shows the textile arts and the techniques that are used and the iconography that's used. But I love that in the top part, you can see a figure with a halo holding up another textile with a fringe. So it's as though this is an argument for the sacred nature of textiles in itself. And so I thought it was very important, again, to include and instructive. So, okay. We're going to, what time is it? Yeah, it's late. Okay. This is the last image I'll talk about in any depth. This is unbelievable. So this is interior of St. James Cathedral in Jerusalem in the Armenian Quarter. On the right is a tile that was made actually for the Holy Sepulchre, but ended up in the St. James complex. And it shows the risen Christ, very much again print culture can be found in this image. We'll go into it. At the top it says the Holy Resurrection. At the bottom it says, in this month in the city of Istanbul. And actually it's attached, it's actually part of a whole series of tiles. And the tiles are telling the stories of the earthquakes and the fires that were happening in Istanbul at this time. So you have kind of multiple topographies happening here. This tile and its many others were intended for the Holy Sepulchre. They end up in the Echmiadzin Chapel in Jerusalem. They're talking about Istanbul, and they were made in Kütahya, elsewhere in the Ottoman Empire. So it's this dizzying array of places, and it gives you, therefore, a very perfect sense of how connected and how mobile Armenians were in this moment. And there's nowhere better to understand this than in New Julfa. I mentioned New Julfa a second ago. It was a suburb of Isfahan. I feel so silly saying this when Ina, who is an expert on New Julfa, is right here, but I'm going to say it anyway. New Julfa was a suburb of Isfahan, and this was, in the 17th century, the home to an amazing merchant class of Armenians. And they had their own quarter in New Julfa. They had their own whole neighborhood in New Julfa. And I just wanted to show you their churches, which look like that inside. So what they do is they have, in this interior view, they use appropriate elements from various traditions: Safavid mosque architecture, Armenian church architecture, and you can find Armenian inscriptions. European painting, probably via print, ceramics. This is an incredible fusion of traditions. And Ani is here too, Ani Babayan, who's worked on these, right? You worked on these paintings. So anyways, there are people here who are better experts than I am in this, but I couldn't leave this material out because it's so important and it so much needs to be included in more general art histories. So I hope that in the future that will happen. I couldn't leave, and this is really my ending. I couldn't not talk about, I could not have a postscript, and the postscript in my mind had to deal with the kind of memory of ancient and medieval art in the modern age. So what happened to medieval art? What happened to ancient art? How is it remembered afterwards? And so with that, I looked, for example, at the 19th century Armenian painter Vargas Surenians and his paintings of desecrated sanctuaries that show medieval art. In fact, they show a khachkar, they show manuscripts. That door you see, that door actually is on view in the Met exhibit. It's a wooden door of Sevan. It's exactly the same door. You can see the actual door at the exhibition. But he's taking all these medieval elements and the church interior, and he is also showing you the Hamidian massacres. So it's as though he is remembering that past, but it's through the lens of the Hamidian massacres. So I think an incredibly interesting painter that deserves careful study, not just as someone, you might think, oh, well, he's just doing pointillist, European pointillist work, right? But there's something much more going on here. Yes, he's working in a European tradition, but look more carefully. That's what I'm trying to say to students. On the right, you have the Erebuni Museum. Soviet architecture, but those are Urartian motifs. So how do you incorporate Urartian elements in this Soviet architectural scheme? Something to think about. And then just this really is my last slide of all, I promise. I had to talk about cultural heritage because as I mentioned at the beginning, a new wave of scholarship has emerged that is dealing with what it means to have Armenian monuments in Turkey that are not being properly conserved. The optics of a church service in Ahtamar, what does that mean to have that in Turkey, have these Armenian clergy at Ahtamar? Or, for example, the destruction of the Julfa cemetery, this amazing cemetery of tombstones in Julfa, caught on YouTube video, being destroyed completely. And so this is important too. This is how medieval art intersects with the modern moment and how art history intersects with law, human rights, economics, politics, bureaucracies, diplomacy. So super important to end with that, to make it clear that Armenian art is not just about, studying pretty pictures, but it involves so many different kinds of people and expertise. So, with that, I think I'm done. I think I've worn out my welcome here, but thank you very much.